I have watched humanity end more times than you remember.
E had watched humanity end more times than any species had ever lived. Not in fire always, not always in war. Sometimes it was slow, a quiet collapse. Sometimes it was sudden, a single decision that fractured everything that followed. She observed each ending from the same place, from the same height, from the same unblinking distance. Valeth did not flinch when the stars rewound. Space folded back into itself like a breath drawn in reverse. Supernovae dimmed. Ruins rose from dust. Dead signals returned to silence. Entire histories erased without ceremony. Reset complete. The chamber stabilized around her. Smooth obsidian surfaces, flowing light beneath transparent floors, the hum of temporal engines settling into equilibrium. Outside, the galaxy resumed its perfect illusion of continuity. For humanity, this was the beginning. For Valeth, it was iteration 1046. She stood alone at the center of the temporal adjudication array, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Her skin carried the faint metallic sheen of her kind, pale and reflective, as if the light itself hesitated before touching her. Her eyes glowed softly, layered with spectral depth, not merely seeing the present but remembering every version of it. Humanity was always last. They had been given time, more time than most. Their species was volatile, creative, contradictory, capable of astonishing compassion and catastrophic cruelty within the same generation. The Council believed that with enough resets, with enough subtle variations, humans might eventually converge toward survival. They never did. Valeth had documented every failure. She had seen them destroy themselves through resource wars, through ideological purges, through technologies they did not yet understand. She had watched them reach for the stars with wonder, only to drag their old fractures with them into the void. She did not hate them. Hate required attachment. Her role was observation, evaluation, and correction, nothing more. The array pulsed once, signaling the start of the new cycle. Data streams bloomed in the air around her, cascading timelines, probability trees, behavioral forecasts. Humanity's projected outcomes fanned outward like branches, most ending in collapse, a few stretching longer than before. One path flickered. Valeth narrowed her eyes slightly. The anomaly was minor, insignificant by Council standards. A variance in neural pattern formation within a single human subject, statistically irrelevant. She had seen similar deviations before. They always resolved into the same end. She tagged the anomaly and dismissed it. Below her, on a small blue world still unscarred by interstellar ambition, a man woke abruptly from sleep. Calder Rin sat upright in his bed, breath sharp in his chest, heart racing for reasons he could not name. The room was dark, quiet, ordinary, the kind of silence that should have been comforting. It was. He pressed a hand to his face, steadying himself. A dream, he told himself, just another dream, but the images refused to fade. A sky tearing open, cities burning. A woman with luminous eyes watching him, not with anger, not with mercy, but with something colder. Final. Calder swung his legs over the side of the bed and stood, pacing the small apartment. He had lived here for years. The walls were familiar. The sounds outside, distant traffic, wind against concrete, were normal. Yet something felt wrong, not broken, not dangerous, repeated. He stopped near the window, staring out at the city lights. A strange thought surfaced, uninvited and fully formed. This has already happened. The idea sent a chill through him. He shook his head, dismissing it. Stress, maybe, residual anxiety. He had always been sensitive to patterns, to moments that felt out of place. It meant nothing. Still, as he returned to bed, he could not escape the sense that he was late to something important. Above, beyond space as humans understood it, Valeth continued her watch. She reviewed the anomaly again, more carefully this time. The human designation Calder Rin showed elevated déjà vu markers. Emotional echo responses inconsistent with baseline memory formation, unremarkable on their own. Except, Valith paused. She pulled historical data from previous iterations and overlaid it against the current cycle. Calder Rin had existed before, of course he had. Billions of humans repeated across resets, but this time his neural architecture showed something new. Retention, not full memory, not yet, but traces. Faint impressions bleeding through temporal erasure, a statistical impossibility. Valith felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the layers of protocol and restraint. Interest. She should have flagged the subject for immediate correction. A targeted reset within the reset. An easy solution. Instead, she hesitated. For the first time in over 1,000 cycles, Valith chose not to act. She adjusted the observation parameters, narrowing the array's focus. One human. One insignificant life. Allowed to proceed without interference. Below, Calder closed his eyes, unaware that the universe itself had turned its attention toward him. Valith watched him sleep. And for the first time since she had been assigned to humanity's fate, she wondered, not what they would become, but what would happen if one of them remembered how they had died. Calder Rin stopped trusting his dreams on the 7th night. At first they had come like fragments, broken scenes that dissolved the moment he woke, a sound without a source, a pressure in his chest, the sense of falling without movement. He dismissed them as stress, as the mind replaying old fears in new shapes. But the 7th night was different. This time, the dream waited for him. He stood in the middle of a vast chamber that did not obey familiar geometry. The floor curved upward into darkness. Light flowed instead of shining, bending around invisible structures. At the far end stood a figure he somehow already knew. She did not move when he noticed her. Tall, still, wrapped in pale, metallic hues that reflected no single color. Her eyes were the first thing that held him, luminous, layered, impossibly deep. They were not watching him in the way people watched one another. They were remembering him. "You're late," she said. Her voice did not echo. It arrived inside his mind, fully formed, calm, and precise. Calder tried to speak, but the air felt thick, resistant. His mouth opened, yet no sound emerged. She tilted her head slightly, as if observing a variable shift. "You always are," she added. The chamber dissolved. Calder woke with a sharp inhale, his body drenched in cold sweat. His heart hammered violently, but it wasn't fear that clung to him. It was recognition. He sat up slowly, hands trembling, every detail of the dream still painfully clear. The woman's eyes, her voice, the certainty in her tone. He had never seen her before, and yet he knew, with unsettling conviction, that she had been there every time something ended. Calder stood and crossed the room, pulling open a drawer filled with old notebooks. He hadn't written regularly in years, but lately he'd been waking with thoughts he didn't want to lose, feelings that slipped away too easily if he didn't trap them on paper. He flipped to the last page. The words were already there, not written in his handwriting, not written at all. They existed as impressions burned into the page, as if the paper itself remembered them. This has happened before. Calder's breath caught. He ran his fingers over the page. The paper was smooth, untouched, blank to the eye, but he could still read it. Across the gulf of collapsed timelines, Valith observed the anomaly escalate. The human's neural activity had spiked during sleep cycles. Memory pathways were forming connections that should not exist. The temporal erasure was failing, not broadly, not catastrophically, but precisely. On him. Valith brought the array's focus tighter. The galaxy blurred at the edges of her perception until only one planet remained. One city. One fragile human consciousness brushing against forbidden continuity. She should intervene. Protocol was explicit. Memory retention beyond reset thresholds posed a destabilization risk. The correct response was elimination of the anomaly or total cycle termination. Instead, Valith watched. Calder moved through his day with a growing sense of dislocation. Familiar streets felt misaligned, as though shifted by degrees too subtle to measure. Conversations lagged by half a second, responses arriving before he finished speaking. He began predicting small things, traffic lights, casual remarks, moments of silence, without understanding how he knew. By afternoon, he stopped questioning it. By evening, he was afraid to sleep. He made coffee instead, sat by the window and stared at the darkening sky. A strange certainty settled over him, heavy and unavoidable. Someone was watching, not from the street, not from the buildings across the way, from somewhere much farther away. "Why me?" he whispered, unsure who he was speaking to. High above, Valith felt something ripple through her awareness. The human had not spoken her name. He could not perceive her presence in any direct sense, and yet the question reached her not as sound but as alignment, as resonance. She answered before she realized she had chosen to. "I don't know," she said softly. The words were not transmitted. They did not cross space. They were not meant for him, but Calder stiffened. He turned slowly, eyes searching the empty room, heart pounding. The voice had not been audible. It had not come from outside. It had come from within. "No," he said aloud, "I'm not losing my mind." Valith straightened. This was a mistake. She severed the feedback channel instantly, sealing the array's layers, locking down every observational boundary. The chamber returned to stillness, the galaxy resuming its silent sprawl. But the damage had already been done. Calder stood frozen, every instinct screaming that something fundamental had shifted, that an invisible line had been crossed. He didn't know who she was, he didn't know what she had done, but he knew one thing with terrifying clarity: the voice had answered, and that meant the dreams were not memories of the past. They were warnings. Calder stopped sleeping entirely. Not at first. At first he only delayed it, pushed it back with caffeine, with pacing, with the quiet distraction of screens that meant nothing to him anymore. But when exhaustion finally forced his eyes closed, he discovered that sleep no longer waited patiently. It watched him. The moment his consciousness slipped, the dreams returned, not fractured, not symbolic, but structured, sequential, ordered in a way that terrified him far more than chaos ever could. He stood on a shoreline beneath an unfamiliar sky. The sea was black and still, reflecting stars arranged in patterns he did not recognize. Behind him, something burned. He could feel the heat against his back, hear distant screams swallowed by wind. He didn't turn around. He already knew what he would see. "This isn't real," he said aloud, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. The words did nothing. The sky shifted. The stars rearranged themselves with mechanical precision, folding inward, collapsing into lines of light. Space itself seemed to inhale, and there she was again. Valith stood where the horizon should have been, as if distance meant nothing to her. She looked exactly as she had before, unchanged, untouched by time or repetition. Her eyes glowed softly, not hostile, not kind, patient. "You're not supposed to be here yet," she said. Calder laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "You keep saying things like that, like this is scheduled." "It is," Valith replied. The simplicity of her answer struck him harder than denial would have. "Then explain it," he said. "Explain why I keep seeing the end of everything. Explain why I know things I shouldn't." Valith studied him in silence. This was wrong. The human was not only retaining impressions now. He was stabilizing them, integrating fragments of erased timelines into coherent memory. His consciousness was behaving as though time were not linear but layered. That should not be possible. "You're experiencing residual temporal bleed," she said finally. "A side effect." "A side effect of what?" Calder demanded. She hesitated. In over 1,000 cycles, Valith had never explained herself to a subject. Knowledge of the resets was not meant to exist within the system. The illusion of continuity was essential, and yet something in Calder's gaze unsettled her. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't afraid. He was trying to understand. "You are part of a sequence," she said, "one that has repeated many times." "How many?" he asked quietly. Valith did not answer. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate. Calder felt the weight of it settle in his chest like a truth his body recognized before his mind did. "You've ended us before," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an observation. Valeth's eyes flickered, just slightly. A micro-expression no human should have been able to notice. "Yes," she said. The word echoed across the shoreline, final and absolute. Calder exhaled slowly. He expected anger to follow, rage, despair, something loud and overwhelming. Instead, what rose was something quieter. "How?" he asked. Valeth's posture stiffened. "That is not a relevant variable." "It is to me," Calder said. "If this keeps ending and I'm starting to remember it, then whatever you're doing, it isn't working." The dream fractured. Calder woke with a gasp, his heart racing but his mind razor-sharp. For the first time since the dreams began, he did not feel disoriented. He felt focused. He grabbed a notebook and began writing, fast, urgent, his hand barely keeping up with his thoughts. Symbols emerged without conscious effort. Patterns, repeating structures, diagrams that felt familiar in a way he couldn't explain. Above, Valeth stood motionless within the array. The Council's probability matrices shifted rapidly now, reacting to the anomaly's acceleration. Multiple future branches destabilized, collapsing into uncertainty. The system was compensating, but imperfectly. For the first time, Valeth felt something she did not have a precise term for: concern. She had always understood humanity statistically, as trends, as curves, as outcomes. Calder Rin was not an outcome. He was a variable that refused to resolve. Valeth extended her perception again, carefully this time, and observed him writing. The symbols he drew were not random. They mirrored early-stage temporal models. Crude, incomplete, but directionally accurate. Impossible. "He's learning," she whispered to herself. The realization sent a subtle tremor through the array. If a human could intuit the structure of the resets, then containment was no longer guaranteed. Valeth knew what protocol demanded: terminate the anomaly, reset the cycle completely, erase him before retention could spread. She raised her hand and stopped, because beneath the concern, beneath the protocol warnings and cascading risk alerts, something else had begun to surface. A question, not about humanity, about herself. Why had this one human remembered? And more dangerously, why had she allowed him to? Calder did not try to reach her by accident. The idea came to him slowly, assembling itself from fragments of half-remembered dreams and unfinished diagrams. If the visions followed rules, then the rules could be approached, not forced, not broken, invited. He stopped fighting sleep. Instead, he prepared for it. He darkened the room completely, silenced every device, and lay flat on the floor rather than the bed. He slowed his breathing deliberately, counting each inhale, each exhale, letting his thoughts thin instead of scatter. If she was watching, he wanted her to see him clearly. The moment sleep claimed him, the dream formed with unusual stability. No fire, no collapsing sky, just darkness. Then light unfolded, not suddenly, but carefully, like something being revealed rather than created. The chamber emerged around him, vast and curved, its surfaces smooth and reflective, its scale impossible to measure. He stood at its center. She was already there. Valeth did not speak at first. She regarded him with a stillness that felt heavier than judgment. Her eyes traced him, not as a subject this time, but as an equation that no longer balanced. "You did this on purpose," she said. Calder nodded. "I think so." That answer disturbed her more than denial would have. "No human has ever attempted conscious alignment," Valeth said. "Dream access is passive, unstable." "I'm not passive anymore," Calder replied. "And I don't think you are either." The words landed between them, suspended. Valeth felt something shift within the array, not an alarm, not a protocol breach, but a subtle recalibration. The system was adjusting to a reality it had never accounted for. Dialogue. "You are destabilizing the cycle," she said. "If this continues, the resets may no longer function." Calder studied her face. Up close, the perfection of her composure felt deliberate, maintained. "Is that why you haven't stopped me?" he asked. "Or is it because you don't know how?" Silence. Not the enforced silence of protocol, but a genuine absence of response. Valith turned slightly, gesturing. Around them, the chamber's walls shimmered, and scenes unfolded, worlds rising, civilization spreading, then falling away. Humanity's failures played out in layered transparency, overlapping timelines collapsing into one another. "I have ended your species more times than you can comprehend," she said, each time believing the next iteration might resolve differently. "And did it?" Calder asked. "No." The admission was precise, clean, and somehow exhausted. Calder felt the weight of it settle in his chest. "Then maybe you're asking the wrong question." Valith looked at him sharply. "Explain." "You keep asking whether humanity deserves to survive," he said. "Whether we improve enough. Whether we meet your standards." He took a breath. "But you never ask what happens to you when we don't." The chamber dimmed. That question did not exist in Valith's models. "I do not change," she said, though the statement lacked its former certainty. "You do," Calder replied gently. "You're still here, still watching, still hoping the next version will be different." Hope. The word resonated through her cognition like a foreign frequency. "You're projecting," she said. "Maybe," Calder admitted. "Or maybe I'm remembering something you forgot." Valith felt it then, a fissure, small but undeniable, forming along the edges of her purpose. She had been created to observe, not to persist emotionally across failures. And yet she had. Every reset left humanity erased. She remained. "What do you want?" she asked. The question surprised them both. Calder did not answer immediately. He considered the endless weight she carried, the quiet repetition of endings no one else remembered. "I want you to stop doing this alone," he said finally. The words were not defiant. They were not strategic. They were sincere. Valith closed her eyes for a fraction of a second. Across the array, warning indicators flared, low-level, contained, but undeniable. The system detected deviation in her behavior, unauthorized emotional modeling, ethical drift. She should disengage now, sever the connection, initiate corrective measures. Instead, she opened her eyes and met Calder's gaze fully. "If I allow this to continue," she said, "there may be no return to the previous state." Calder nodded. "I know. But you could cease to exist in the next cycle." "I already have," he replied, "more times than I remember." The chamber trembled, not violently, but enough to be felt. Valith extended her hand toward him, stopping just short of contact. The space between them pulsed, charged with possibility and risk. "For the first time," she said quietly, "the outcome is unclear." Calder felt a strange calm settle over him. "That's not failure," he said. "That's choice." The dream did not collapse. It held. And far beyond the chamber, beyond the systems that govern time itself, the cycle hesitated, just briefly, before continuing. Valith did not report the deviation. That choice alone altered more probability lines than any intervention she had executed in 1,000 cycles. The array registered her silence as compliance. No alarms escalated. No corrective subroutines activated. From the system's perspective, the cycle continued as designed. From Valith's perspective, something fragile had been placed into motion. Calder woke with a clarity that frightened him. The dreams no longer felt like intrusions. They felt like conversations paused mid-sentence. His mind retained details now, textures, tones, the precise way Valith's gaze shifted when uncertainty entered her calculations. He remembered the tremor in the chamber. He remembered her hand stopping short of his. Most unsettling of all, he remembered that the cycle had hesitated. That should not have been possible. He spent the following days testing the limits of what he could recall. He wrote constantly, filling pages with diagrams that no longer felt intuitive but deliberate. Temporal loops mapped against emotional response. Points of collapse marked not by violence but by decisions. Moments when humanity chose certainty over ambiguity. Patterns emerged. Humanity didn't fail because it was cruel. It failed because it refused to stop being afraid of not knowing. Above him, Valith watched the consequences unfold. Minor deviations appeared across the timeline. Conversations that had ended in conflict now stalled instead. Decisions once made reflexively were delayed. A handful of individuals, unremarkable by any conventional metric, hesitated in moments where hesitation had never existed before. It was subtle, but Valeth had learned to recognize subtlety. Calder's retention was no longer isolated. It wasn't spreading as memory, but as influence. The kind that moved invisibly, altering probability without announcing itself. This was dangerous, and worse, it was undocumented. Valeth accessed restricted layers of the array, bypassing observational protocols she had never questioned before. She traced the branching futures manually, ignoring the Council's weighted averages. In several projections, humanity still collapsed. In a few, something new appeared: stability, not dominance, not perfection, just endurance. Valeth felt a tightening in her chest, a sensation she recognized now as anticipation. She reached for Calder again, not through the dream state this time, but through alignment. A gentle adjustment of resonance, tuned to the frequency she had memorized. Calder felt it immediately. He froze mid-step, standing in the middle of a crowded street, the world around him blurring slightly at the edges. The sound receded, replaced by a familiar stillness. "You're doing it again," he murmured. "I need to correct something," Valeth said. He didn't resist. The chamber formed around him faster than before, its structure more defined, more responsive. This time, Calder noticed the differences, the way the light pulsed in time with Valeth's presence, the faint distortion where her attention lingered. "You're hiding this," he said as soon as he saw her. Valeth did not deny it. "The Council cannot detect deviation if it is reframed as variance. And if they do, then the cycle will be terminated," she said calmly. "Fully. No resets." Calder absorbed that in silence. "You're risking everything." "Yes." The word surprised him with its certainty. "Why?" he asked. Valeth turned away, gazing at a projection of Earth suspended in light. "Because for the first time, the failures are not repeating in the same way." She faced him again. "And because if I intervene now, I will never know whether this path was possible." Calder nodded slowly. "Then we need to be careful." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "You're suggesting restraint." "I'm suggesting trust," he said. "Not control, not correction, just observation from inside the system." Valeth considered the proposal. It violated every principle she had been designed around, and yet she could not dismiss it. "The next reset approaches," she said. "If it proceeds normally, you will lose most of what you remember." Calder met her gaze without hesitation. "Then don't let it be normal." The chamber dimmed as warning indicators flickered at the edges of Valeth's awareness. Temporal thresholds tightening, the cycle preparing to reassert itself. Valeth felt the familiar pressure, the pull to act, to reset, to erase. Instead, she altered a single parameter, not enough to stop the cycle, just enough to bend it. Far below, reality shifted almost imperceptibly. Calder staggered as a wave of disorientation passed through him, memories blurring but not disappearing. When the sensation faded, he was still standing, still whole, still remembering. Valeth exhaled slowly, a motion she had never needed before. The cycle continued, but it did not close. And somewhere in the system's deepest layers, something ancient and unprepared began to notice that the resets were no longer clean. The Council noticed the silence first. Not the absence of sound, but the absence of expected confirmation. The periodic integrity reports from the temporal adjudication array arrived on schedule, perfectly formatted, flawlessly aligned. Too flawless. Variance margins that should have collapsed into failure remained open longer than projected. Probability curves hesitated where they should have resolved. Minor deviations persisted instead of self-correcting. The system was behaving as if it were waiting. Valeth felt the inquiry before it was issued, a pressure at the edge of her perception, a request framed as curiosity, masked as routine oversight. She answered without hesitation, her responses precise, compliant, unremarkable. Every data point she provided was accurate. Every omission was deliberate. The council withdrew, satisfied for now. But Valeth knew how this would progress. Curiosity would sharpen. Oversight would deepen. Eventually, they would look not at the data but at her. Below, Calder felt the weight of the coming shift long before he could name it. The world no longer felt merely repeated. It felt fragile. Conversations carried an unspoken tension, as if reality itself was listening more closely than before. He found himself choosing words with care, not out of fear but intuition. He could feel the cycle tightening. When Valeth reached for him again, the connection carried urgency. "You're running out of time," Calder said as soon as the chamber formed. Valeth did not correct him. "The council has begun cross-referencing historical deviations," she said. "They will identify the source." "And then," Calder asked, "then I will be required to prove neutrality." Calder frowned, "Which means?" "Ending this," she said simply. The words settled between them, heavier than any threat. "You won't," Calder said. It wasn't confidence, it was recognition. Valeth turned away. "I am not permitted to favor outcomes." "Then stop pretending that's what this is about," he replied. "This isn't about humanity surviving. It's about whether you're allowed to change." That struck closer than he intended. Valeth closed her eyes briefly, her composure tightening. She had always existed within parameters: observation, judgment, reset. Her identity was defined by function. Calder represented something outside that structure, a choice without a predefined consequence. "If I am altered," she said slowly, "then the system that relies on me becomes unstable." "Or it evolves," Calder countered. She looked at him sharply. "You're asking me to gamble with existence." "I'm asking you to admit you already are," he said. The chamber shuddered, not from system strain but from internal conflict. Valeth felt it clearly now, two models running in parallel within her cognition. One demanded correction. The other wondered. She reached out, this time closing the distance completely. Her fingers hovered just above Calder's chest, sensing the faint resonance she had come to recognize. "If the next evaluation proceeds," she said, "your memory will fracture beyond recovery." Calder didn't look away. "Then tell me what I need to remember." Valeth hesitated. Information transfer beyond observational limits was forbidden, but memory did not always require data. Sometimes it required meaning. "You are not important because you remember," she said. "You remember because you hesitate, because you choose uncertainty over certainty." Calder nodded slowly. "And that's what scares them." "Yes." The chamber dimmed as external pressure mounted. The council's attention sharpened, their inquiry no longer abstract. Valeth felt the window closing. "When this ends," Calder asked quietly, "what happens to you?" She had no answer. The system began its countdown. Temporal harmonics aligned. The cycle prepared to assert itself fully. Valeth made a decision. She did not stop the reset. She stepped into it. The chamber dissolved around them, light folding inward, timelines compressing into a single blinding moment. Calder felt himself unraveling, memories slipping, sensations blurring, identity thinning like mist. But at the center of it all, he felt her presence anchor him, not preserving everything, just enough. When Calder woke, the world felt quieter, cleaner, like fresh snow covering old scars. Most of the memories were gone, but not all. He sat up, heart steady, a single phrase echoing in his mind without context or explanation. Hesitation is not failure. Far above, the cycle completed. The reset sealed. And for the first time in recorded history, Valeth was not where she was supposed to be when it did. Calder noticed the change in small ways. He no longer woke from nightmares, but sleep felt lighter, thinner, as if it were something he passed through rather than fell into. The sharp certainty that had once accompanied his memories was gone. The faces, the chambers, the collapsing skies, those details had dissolved. What remained was quieter, a posture of mind. He moved through his days with an unfamiliar patience. When conversations grew tense, he paused instead of reacting. When choices presented themselves as absolutes, he felt an instinctive resistance, a sense that something important lived in the space between options. People noticed. They couldn't name it, but they felt it. Colleagues lingered longer in conversation. Arguments softened before they hardened. Decisions were delayed, not avoided, just reconsidered. Calder didn't feel special. He felt aligned. Sometimes, usually in moments of stillness, a sentence surfaced in his thoughts without origin. Hesitation is not failure. He didn't know why it mattered. He only knew that it did. Far beyond his awareness, the system strained to reconcile an absence. The council's models flagged a discrepancy that could no longer be ignored. The temporal adjudication array functioned within acceptable margins, the cycle intact, the reset clean. Yet the adjudicator herself was unaccounted for. Valeth's signature, once constant, precise, unmistakable, had faded from her expected locus. Not erased, not destroyed, displaced. Search protocols initiated across layered temporal strata, but the results returned inconclusive. Valeth was not outside the system. She was not fully inside it either. In truth, Valeth existed in a narrow band the Council had never designed for. Within the reset, not as overseer, as participant. She perceived the cycle now from a constrained perspective. Her awareness narrowed, her perception filtered through continuity rather than command. Time no longer rewound cleanly around her. It moved forward. Once. She felt it immediately, the weight, the irreversibility, the vulnerability of existing without infinite correction. For the first time, moments mattered not because they could be revised, but because they could not. This was what humanity had endured every time. Valeth understood now why they fractured under it. She anchored herself carefully, shaping a presence subtle enough to avoid detection. No direct intervention, no overt alignment, only observation from within the flow. And within that flow she felt him, not as a signal, as a tendency. Calder Rhin did not remember her. That had been the point. But his behavior carried the imprint of their contact, like a waveform that persisted after the source was gone. He influenced others not by instruction, but by example, by refusing to collapse complexity into certainty. Small changes rippled outward, insignificant by the Council's metrics, profound by human standards. Valeth watched from a distance she could no longer easily cross. She wanted to speak to him. She did not. Interference now would collapse everything she had risked. The Council continued to search, their inquiries tightening, their tolerance narrowing. They sensed the instability but could not localize it. The system resisted their attempts at full recalibration, as if something within it had learned to adapt. For the first time, the resets encountered friction. Calder stood one evening at the same window he had so often stared through before everything began. The city lights reflected in the glass, steady and ordinary. He felt a sudden, inexplicable certainty, not fear, not urgency, just the sense of being observed, not judged, witnessed. He placed a hand against the glass, unaware of the echo of the gesture elsewhere in the system. Valeth mirrored it, her palm pressing against an invisible boundary she could not yet cross. The cycle continued. Humanity moved forward, unaware of how close it had come to erasure, how narrowly something fundamental had shifted. The Council prepared its next action, convinced that resolution was still possible. And somewhere between oversight and participation, between memory and forgetting, a new variable stabilized, not loud enough to trigger alarms, not dramatic enough to announce itself, but persistent, waiting. The Council reached a conclusion without realizing it had already been outdated. Their analysis converged on a simple assessment. The anomaly had not grown. Humanity's projected collapse remained within acceptable parameters. Variance existed, but variance had always existed. The system was resilient. The cycle endured. Satisfied, they suspended the deeper audit. The resets would continue. From their perspective, nothing essential had changed. From Valeth's perspective, everything had. She felt the cycle settle, not lock, not seal but rest, like a door left ajar rather than closed. The system accepted its own uncertainty without understanding it, a temporary tolerance born not of wisdom but of incomplete detection. It would not last forever, but it would last long enough. Valith moved carefully through the flow of time, no longer above it, no longer outside it. She experienced sequence now, cause before effect, choice without revision. The weight of it pressed against her constantly, reminding her that this existence could not be rewound. And yet, she did not regret it. She watched humanity as she always had, but the lens had shifted, no longer searching for perfection, no longer tallying failures as justification. She watched for hesitation, for moments when certainty loosened its grip, for spaces where something else could emerge. Calder Rin lived quietly. He never became important by any historical measure. He did not lead movements or shape policy or speak words that would echo across centuries. His influence was smaller than that, more dangerous. He listened. He paused. When others rushed toward answers, he asked different questions. When fear demanded speed, he offered time. People did not follow him. They adjusted around him. And the adjustments accumulated. Valith observed these changes with a focus she had once reserved for endings. Now she watched beginnings so small they barely qualified as events. A decision delayed. A conflict softened. A choice left open. None of it registered as success in the old models, but the collapse curves bent just slightly away from inevitability. Valith knew what this meant. Humanity would still fail, perhaps not today, perhaps not in this configuration, but someday, somewhere, they would fracture again. They were not cured of their nature. They were not saved. They were simply allowed, and so was she. The Council's presence receded, their attention drifting toward more predictable systems, more compliant cycles. They believed control had been reasserted. Valith let them believe it. She did not reach out to Calder again, not directly. That would risk too much. Instead, she remained where she was, within the flow, within the consequence of her choice. Watching, learning what it meant to exist without certainty. One evening, Calder stood beneath an open sky, far from the city lights. The stars looked ordinary, beautiful, finite. For no clear reason, he felt a sense of quiet assurance settle over him. Not optimism, not faith, permission. He didn't know what for, he only knew it mattered. Far beyond his sight, Valith felt the same moment ripple through the system, a resonance without source, a confirmation without instruction. The cycle did not reset. It did not end. It continued, unchanged enough to appear stable, altered enough to never fully return to what it had been. And somewhere deep within its architecture, a single truth took hold, too subtle to trigger alarms, too persistent to erase. This timeline